Hey, I'm Aluka, a 3D print artist. I needed to find something to appease the YouTube gods and something I can make, so I settled on Moana. Hey Hey. Making Moana will be too hard, and I like the path of least resistance, so let's get started. First, you need a front and side profile of whatever you're making and some parchment paper so the filament doesn't stick. For the filament, I bought this gray filament for no other reason than it was the cheapest on Amazon. This roll of filament will last me at least 4 or 5 projects depending on what I'm making. 3D print art is such a cheap hobby and I wish more people knew about it. To start making Hei Hei, the first thing I make is an outline of his body. This is because to make something 3D, you need a flat shape to build up. Then you make another body outline, cut it in half, and add it to the original one. You can see it started to become 3D. The next step is adding lines of filament to create the frame. One by one, you add a layer and pull it up. I recently watched Moana 2, which inspired this project, and I wasn't a big fan of the movie. I love that they gave those cute coconut people a better backstory, and I was actually thinking about making them instead of Hei Hei. I'm not going to spoil the movie here, but I don't think it's better than the first one. A movie I would recommend is The Wild Robot, which I'll be making soon if all goes well. That movie felt like prime Pixar. Next were the legs, and I always struggle with the legs because the legs are hard. I swear you can make these the exact same way and they'll turn out completely different. It's kind of like drawing two eyes the exact same. Since I didn't have a bottom view of Hei Hei, I had to freehand the feet. The great thing about working with the 3D pen is you can really improvise anything if you wanted to. You don't even need a picture to start out with. The final step of making the frame was adding the feet to the legs. Then the dreadful process of filling in the frame begins. I always cheap out on this part because it gets boring, but I was patient this time. Making a good frame now minimizes things I need to fix later. It's just very time consuming. Filling in this frame took maybe 2 hours. It takes that long because the frame consists of multiple layers and a final layer of filling it in. So imagine how long bigger projects take. Here's the frame, and the proportions aren't quite correct, but fixing them is relatively easy. But first, I'm going to remove the legs to make sure they are the same size, and once I fix them, I'll add them back on. To smooth out the filament, I'll be using a Clover mini iron because it's very large. You could also use a regular soldering iron, it'll just take more time. Also, keep in mind while I'm smoothing this out, I'm also pushing filament around to create the desired shape. And well, this is fine. All I need to do is fill in the gaps with more filament. This is perfectly normal. To smooth out the feet, I switch to the soldering iron with the pointed tip, then switch back to the Clover mini iron to smooth out the bottom. I still need to do more work with the top of the legs, but taking them off the body helped tremendously. The next step was filling in all the aforementioned gaps with filament. Then I brought back out the Clover mini iron to go over the newly added filament to make it all smooth. Sanding was the next step, but I didn't need to sand a lot of this because I'll be making every single feather myself. I could have made a design on top to give the illusion of feathers, but I went the extra step and it turned out great. Now for the eyes, which are another tricky thing. To make sure they're the same position, I gave Hei Hei a lobotomy. Then I carefully removed filament to create the shape of his eyes. You may say this looks crazy, and I won't disagree. For the eyes, I'll be using this paint palette I haven't cleaned and never will. I eyeballed it. Get it? I'm sorry. And I thought it would fit perfectly, but they ended up being a bit too large, so I had to cut them to fit. Once they were cut to size, I added them on with filament, and I messed this up numerous times, but you didn't know that until I told you. I used the Clover mini iron for the face details, which I normally wouldn't use, but I lost the tip to my soldering iron. Since the body was done, the face details were next, and the first thing I decided to do was add some fat around the face. I googled it, and this part of the eye is called the eye ring, and I don't know if that's correct these days, but I made it, and it looks nice. I made the beak, which is really easy, just some filament that I pinched into shape and smoothed out. This part is called the comb, when I thought maybe a hair comb was called a comb because of this, or vice versa, but they have nothing to do with each other, which was surprising to me because they look the same. Anyways, I added the legs back on and I got them around the same size. I'm human after all. And it stands up, which was completely planned. I added the wings back, and my regret is that I should have kept everything separate. It would have made the painting process easy, and going forward I'll be separating the pieces into different parts with magnets if I can. The feathers were the part I was most excited to make for some reason, and it's probably because I knew they looked really nice. The process was very simple and straightforward, and I made the tiny feathers the exact same way. To add the large feathers, I made slits in the back and stuck them on while the filament was still hot. This fused them together. The small feathers were a completely different story. Oh, and I burned my hand. Be careful around hot objects, guys. For the large feathers on the chest, I just heated the filament and pressed it down. For the tiny feathers, I needed to manually melt them for the body, then use a lighter to stick the feathers down so they weren't sticking up. This did take extra time, but it was worth it. I've been trying to make more detailed pieces to improve my 3D print skills, and I'm really happy. Smoothing out these feathers was really annoying though, and the details added to the feet, perfect. The final step before I was done was adding the claw to each toe. They also turned out great. If you can't tell already, I'm really proud of this project. It's one of the best things I ever made. Before I painted it, I wanted to get rid of any small imperfections. This would have worked better if I made them into individual pieces, but it still worked. The darker parts are the sanded parts, and I left all the feathers alone because they were smooth. Before I painted, I added a primer, and this spray needs to be heavily diluted. This blue stuff is basically liquid painter's tape, and it worked, but it built up while I was painting, so I'm not sure I used it correctly. And I bought an airbrush. Spoiler, I had no idea how this worked while starting this project, so if you know how to use one, excuse me. I painted the body blue, then mixed that blue with green for the feathers. Then I mixed that green with white to make a highlight. Then I made a lighter shade of that for the wings and used that same shade for the bottom. The feathers got painted yellow, but the liquid mask didn't work and red was on some of the feathers, which made coloring so hard. I'm not a fan of yellow. Good thing orange helped me out and I was able to make it not look horrible. I used a small paintbrush to paint the claws beige. Then it was time for the eyeballs, but luckily for me, I didn't have to make them the same size. For my first time using an airbrush, I think I did pretty good. I learned a lot from my next projects as well. The last thing I did was give it a clear coat, and it's done.